So let's get started. Just want to say hi, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for today's program, Landmark Nominations from Inspiration to Designation. My name is Melissa Loriano, and I serve as the Programs Associate for the DC Preservation League. For those of you who may be new to DCPL, our organization has been dedicated to preserving and protecting the historic and built environment of Washington, D.C. since 1971. So before we officially get started, I just wanted to share a few brief technical notes about how today's presentation will work. So please use the Q&A box found at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions directly to our presenter. I will collect your questions at the end of the presentation and verbally ask them of our presenter during our Q&A portion of the program. If we do not get to all of your questions, you can email us at info@dcpreservation.org and we can pass them along to our speaker. For those of you joining us on Facebook Live, my colleague Jessica Unger, our Outreach and Grants Manager, will be monitoring any questions that you might have and will pass those along to me as well. So I am so pleased to introduce you all to today's speaker. Peter Sefton became actively involved in historic preservation in 2002 when he founded the Victorian Secrets of Washington, D.C. internet site to memorialize demolished buildings and publicize threats to vintage buildings of all types. In 2002, he also became active with the DC Preservation League, joining its Board of Trustees and becoming chair of its Landmarks Committee in 2007. He remains a DCPL trustee and chair of the committee today. Peter has researched the history of many buildings in the course of preparing numerous nominations to the DC Inventory of Historic Sites and National Register of Historic Places. And with that, I am so happy to pass this along to Peter.
Hello, hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I'm great.
Great, okay. As Melissa says, I'm Peter. Thank you all very much for tuning in today. In starting to think about this, I think you have to struggle hard to see any good side to our current situation. And if there is one for me, it's that not being able to meet in person has forced me to scrap my last century personal tech. And I have to thank Melissa for all of her patient coaching to get me up to speed with Zoom. One thing the virus hasn't stopped are threats to historic buildings. And this series of talks that she's put together is really going to play a very big part in re-leveling the playing field. My title today may seem like a familiar subject, but I hope that we're going to be looking at it in a little different way. I'm going to try and lay out a practical path by which a feeling, and the feeling is that this building should be saved, can become a concrete action, that this building is in fact actually a designated landmark. I'm going to start by describing what is a landmark, what good is being a landmark, and what does it take to become a landmark. And then we're going to step through the process of getting designated. This won't be a cheats and hacks session for the National Register form, but rather I'm going to try to make some strategic suggestions that will hopefully streamline research and writing one. First, I want to ask, though, an existential question, which is, where do landmark nominations come from? Well, a lot of times they come from the heart. People want to preserve the qualities that make them love their neighborhood. People value their community and wish to preserve places that are significant to it. People are stirred by the beauty of a building, and people are inspired by the qualities of character exhibited by a person or manifested in an event. Of course, feelings in themselves aren't sufficient to designate a landmark. Historic preservation makes good economic sense as well as benefiting the community physically and culturally. But achieving designation requires marshaling hard evidence to establish historical significance that meets very strict criteria. The landmarking process can be complicated and time-consuming, but it's important enough that many people undertake it. As we've counted up, there are over 700 individual landmarks in Washington, D.C. today. One common motivation is the threat of loss. In a city where change is constant and many buildings deserve preservation, last-minute nominations are pretty much inevitable. But one thought I hope to leave is that it's not necessary that a building be under threat to become a landmark, and sometimes being proactive in landmarking them is the best option. Well, maybe the best place to start is another question: what's a landmark? A working definition is that a landmark can be a building. It can be a church, It could be a theater. It can be a factory. It could be a stable. It could be an office building. It could be a civic center. It could be a school. It could be an apartment building. It could be a house. But a landmark can also be a structure, something like this bridge. It can be a site like a park, or it can be an object such as an outdoor statue. In the District of Columbia, landmarks include buildings, structures, sites, and objects. For the sake of simplicity today, we're going to refer to these four categories of landmarks as properties. In the district, properties can be privately owned, like the WARL shelter, which became a landmark last year, or they can be government owned, like the Old Pound, which is now a rec center. It was built in 1912. Besides individual properties, landmarks can be contributing properties to a historic district. But for reasons of time, we're going to talk about individual landmarks today rather than districts, which are kind of their own animal. Another question is, what does being a landmark mean, and how does anybody pursue one? In Washington, a property becomes a landmark when it is listed on the DC Inventory of Historic Sites. This listing, which we call designation, places the landmark property under the protection of the Historic Landmark and Historic District Protection Act of 1978. This municipal law and its supporting regulations control changes that would diminish the property's historic significance, the most extreme of which would be its demolition, which is something that happens a lot here. To be eligible for the landmark law's protection, a property has to meet three essential criteria. It must possess historical significance, it must retain physical integrity, and it must be able to be evaluated from a historical perspective. We'll talk more specifically about what these criteria mean as we go along. So we know that landmark designation protects a historic property from alteration or demolition, but what doesn't it do? Well, it doesn't protect the building's interior. Most landmark designations just apply to a building's outside. There are only about 15 buildings in DC that have landmarked interiors. Almost all of these are large institutional buildings, such as the Recorder of Deeds building. The building for the Recorder of Deeds designation includes its exterior, its public rooms, as well as its fabulous collection of murals, which are designated as artistic objects. Designation also doesn't preserve a building in amber or stop all changes to it. Even if a property is landmarked, the owner is free to make changes which don't require a permit. Changes that do require a permit, such as window replacement or facade alteration, can be made with the approval of the city's Historic Preservation Office or the Historic Preservation Review Board. And we'll talk more about what these names mean in a couple of minutes. Designation doesn't regulate changes to federally owned properties. Although federal properties may be listed on the DC inventory, they are not protected by the DC Historic Preservation Law. This is, of course, because the federal government is not generally subject to state laws. Federal properties do receive some protections if they're deemed eligible for listing on the National Register. They're usually nominated directly to the register by the state historic preservation officer or the agency that owns them. So it's fairly rare that you would actually set out to write your own nomination for one. And this is really probably a pretty good place to clarify what listing on the National Register really means. After a non-federal property has been landmarked by listing on the DC inventory, the DC State Historic Preservation Officer typically recommends that the Department of the Interior enter it on the National Register, which is a federal listing. Being a National Register listed landmark may qualify a property for grants and tax benefits, but it's largely honorific, and it conveys no protections against demolition or alteration. In fact, buildings on the National Register get torn down kind of a lot, too frequently. Those protections that we usually strive for with a landmark nomination come only under local law. And we're very blessed in the district to have a very strong local law. So how does a building become a landmark? As we've sketched, buildings, structures, sites, and objects become designated landmarks if they're listed on the DC inventory of historic sites. But what's the process by which buildings actually get listed on the inventory? Since 1983, the DC Historic Preservation Review Board has had authority for designating historic properties and districts. The HPRB, as we'll call it, considers each application at a hearing, and then it renders a decision on listing by a majority vote right in front of you. The HPRB is now composed of 9 professional and citizen members, and it includes experts in history, prehistoric and historic archaeology, architectural history, and architecture. And then there are also citizen members from a variety of backgrounds who bring additional perspective to the board. The HPRB includes residents from all parts of the city, and under the law, its membership is supposed to reflect the district's demographic diversity. Its members are nominated by the mayor and confirmed by the DC Council. The Historic Preservation Office is the professional staff that supports the HPRB, and it administers many other aspects of the district's preservation program. The function they have that we're going to particularly talk about here is that they're responsible for drafting a recommendation to the review board on each nomination that is filed for designation. So they're a very important part of this process. So we're going to focus now on the initial steps in this designation process, and that's the preparation of a nomination that persuades the HPRB that your property is worthy of listing on the DC inventory. And there's a very primary question there, a very important first question is, who can prepare and sponsor a nomination? Well, the good news is that in Washington, anybody can complete a nomination form. It's not bad news, but the consideration is that there are restrictions on who is standing to sponsor one. Naturally, a property's owner can be its sponsor. You can always sponsor your own property to be a landmark. However, it's important to note that there's no requirement that an owner support or authorize a nomination filed by someone else. And that does come up, particularly when there's a contested nomination. An advisory neighborhood commission can be a sponsor, as can government agencies. And that includes the Historic Preservation Office itself, but that's really, really rare. However, most nominations are sponsored by incorporated nonprofit groups that have historic preservation functions in their bylaws. Very often these are neighborhood civic groups or historic preservation groups, as well as the DC Preservation League, which operates on a citywide basis. Our Landmarks Committee hears regularly from community groups from all over the city. They often seek assistance with preparing a nomination on their own. Sometimes they've prepared one and they're trying to find a sponsor. And we welcome all such inquiries. We really like to, assist people however we can, and we welcome the opportunity to consult. But what is this nomination you're going to create? Well, there's a very close relationship between the criteria for listing on the National Register and those for being listed on the DC inventory. The DC Historic Preservation Office accepts landmark nominations on the National Register registration form. What makes the National Register registration form become a DC inventory nomination form is this cover sheet that you see to the right. It's a one-pager, and often it's one of the last pieces of the nomination package that you will complete, because so much of the information it requires can just be copied from the National Register form when you've completed that. So as we said in the introduction, a completed National Register form can look like a master's thesis with a tax return form pasted in the middle. And that's not a misleading impression. The National Park Service estimates that it takes an average of 100 hours to complete the form. I wasn't going to tell you what the worst case estimate is. That would be 280 hours, but I think that would be more for, a complex of very, very complicated buildings. But sure, when you look at the National Register form, it has tiers of check boxes and has regimens of blank lines, big blocks of empty space that are, kicked off by questions that are phrased in technical jargon. But I'm going to suggest some strategies to streamline completing it and kind of demystify it a little bit. When I'm confronted with a blank National Register form, I have a temptation to jump in on page 1 and just slog through it line by line to the end. But instead of a long march like that, I think maybe first we should scroll through it quickly and break it down into its basic components. You'll find the form has 13 sections, the easiest of which are sections 3 and 4, which you can kind of see section 3 there towards the bottom of the page here. And the reason these are the easiest is they're going to be completed by government officials, and you don't have to worry about them at all. The remainder of the sections of the form are of wildly different complexity, and we might classify them as first, basic identification items, which would be sections 1, 2, and 11. These are very simple fill-in-the-blank type information, like the location of the building and the name of the property and its address. And you might just want to jot them down the first time you go through the form. You should have them right at hand. The next category is the technical information fill-ins, and these are sections 5 and 6. These are more technical fill-in-the-blank and checkbox entries. And then come the big ones, the architectural information, which is section 7, and the statement of significance, which is section 8. And these will be most of your work. They have more technical information fill-ins plus 2 extensive essays. And then there's the reference information. Sections 9 through 13 are the bibliography, geographic codes, maps, and photographic specs. The first section we're going to look at, and I think we just went backwards. Yeah, the first section we're going to look at is section 8, the statement of significance. And that contains the checkboxes for the National Register significance criteria. Frankly, these are your acid test. For your candidate property to be significant enough to designate, it must meet at least one of the 4 criteria. So before you invest a lot of time in research, you want to confirm that your candidate is likely to satisfy one. But here's a confusing thing. As you recall, your first objective is to protect the property through listing on the DC inventory. However, these criteria on the form relate to the National Register. Fortunately, there isn't any real conflict here. Although the DC inventory criteria are broken down into more detailed categories, they're essentially the same thing as the National Register one. They're just packaged a little differently. And so, because for now you're just trying to, frame your approach to the whole nomination, the National Register versions are going to be close enough to stand in for the DC inventory ones. I'm not suggesting that you should lock in on your criteria before your research, but it's very rare to undertake a landmark nomination without knowing anything at all about the property. So I think the strategy here is to keep what you know in mind and then go through the criteria and try to pick out ones that may be relevant. And this will help you to assemble an efficient research plan, as well as just doing a reality check on whether your property is going to be landmarkable at all. In looking over the criteria, remember, one critical rule of thumb is that it's much more valuable to demonstrate that the property clearly meets one single criteria than it meets 2 halfway. 2 halfway does not equal a whole in this at all. All right, so let's first look at Criterion A, which is, of course, history. You're going to select Criterion A if your landmark candidate was a setting for an important event, if it was part of a series of events, or if it illustrates a process of development that was significant to the heritage of the district or the nation, or even your own neighborhood. As you see, DC breaks this criterion down into the 2 criteria that are listed below, events and history. Here are a couple of designated landmarks that we saw a little earlier that do fit very well under Criterion A. Although it wasn't designated a landmark till 2019, the last picture show at the American Theater came in the 1960s. Although it was very long ago divided into retail spaces, you can still look at the building and see that it was an early neighborhood theater. And it probably, since there's not many of these left, it was probably significant to the development of motion picture exhibition in the district. In addition, if you see the building on its block, it served as the anchor of a business block, and it's significant to the development of the Bloomingdale Historic District, although it's not part of that district. So that would put it under Criterion A, potentially. And then also we have the John Fox Slater School, which was designated in 2013. This school was built in 1902 for African-American pupils, and it was plainly significant to the development of DC's historically segregated school system, African-American education, and the development of the Shaw community where it stands. So seeing these and looking at the form, these look like they would probably fit very well under Criterion A. So you can see that even if your property wasn't the scene of a battle or some other great dramatic event, it could be significant to the development of a local community, a social or an ethnic group, an industry or an institution, where it can identify a social trend or a cultural movement. And all of these will work with Criterion A. Criterion B is the reason why most people think of a building as a landmark or being historic. You know, it's kind of the George Washington slept here syndrome. But category B is used very infrequently, or pretty infrequently anyway, and it's very seldom the standalone sole criterion for designation. In part, this is because there's a high bar for establishing that an individual's accomplishments are notable enough and that the building's association is close enough with those accomplishments for it to be considered significant. It's necessary to meet Criterion B that the property be associated with the individual's productive life. A workshop or a studio or an office is much more likely to meet Criterion B than a house, unless it can be established that the activities related to the person's accomplishments were performed at home. Birthplaces or retirement homes are very, very poor fits usually for Criterion B because of the productive life requirement. And finally, the landmark should be the property that is most closely associated with the significant person's accomplishments. Just a peripheral one is not going to do it. Couple of examples. The Historic Preservation Office recommended against recognizing the Harbor Square complex, which was the home of Vice President Hubert Humphrey during his 1968 presidential bid, as significant under Criterion B. This was because although Humphrey lived there, and he occasionally had meetings there, his campaigns had a relatively weak association with it and really a stronger association with other properties. On the other hand, the home of Franklin Kameny, where he hosted many, many, many meetings and did a lot of writing, was designated for its association with his productive life as a leader in Washington's LGBTQ community's fight for civil rights. Criterion C is a big one. This is a really powerful engine for preservation. If Criterion A is history, Criterion C is aesthetics, architecture, and art history. This relatively simple sentence is the umbrella for qualities that the DC criteria breaks down into three separate parts: architecture and urbanism, artistry, and the work of a master. This and criteria A are probably the most common criteria to use, and they're very often used together. There's overlap between them. And hopefully you got a look at the DC criteria, which I think are very well done and very thoughtful and really do sum up the reasons a building could be significant under them. Under Criterion C, buildings can be individual aesthetic masterpieces and expressions of artistic visions, such as I.M. Pei's William Slayton House. And they can be outstanding representatives of an architectural style. Slayton House, even if it wasn't a famous architect, would be among the city's finest examples of mid-century modernism. It's really a very beautiful house and a very inspirational one to a lot of other architects. Masters aren't restricted to architects or formal artists, however, and they can include craftspersons like the Perna family. And the Pernas were a multi-generational firm of Italian-American stonemasons who were based in Tenleytown. They actually had a big stone yard in Tenleytown and a quarry over by Connecticut Avenue. And their work graced innumerable churches and homes, bridges and walls, as well as these very handsome houses, which they built themselves on Chesapeake Street. So we need to be sensitive to the work of artisans. They have such a big role in, how the city looks. And hopefully we'll see a lot more nominations for them. Criterion D is archaeology, and that's probably the most rarely employed criterion. It's probably going to change as technological advantage open more and more windows into what used to be the vanished past, but no longer. Archaeology is usually used as a companion to other criteria. There is kind of a theoretical downside to using it as a standalone criterion, and that is that once an archaeological site is fully processed and it's yielded its share of information and it's been totally dug up and excavated, it may not really retain significance anymore. So something that's designated purely as an archaeological site might be a little bit insecure. There are certainly archaeological sites, though, that will not be processed in that way and will retain their significance forever. But anyway, after you scan these 4 criteria, take a look at the next section, which is called criteria considerations. This is a little bit ominous. These are basically a set of exceptions that apply to certain types of properties and how they may not fit under the criteria. The last one, item G, is the so-called 50-year rule, which comes up a lot. The National Register does state that a landmark should be more than 50 years old and also have achieved significance more than 50 years ago, unless it's of quote unquote extraordinary importance, and they do mean extraordinary. However, here in the district, we don't have that rule. To be listed on the DC inventory, the only requirement is that sufficient time have passed to allow evaluation of a property in its historic context. A related part of that criteria is that the National Register frowns very sternly on listing properties associated with a living person or designated or designed by a living architect, just because you can't really assess that person's stature while they're still alive. They might do something disgraceful tomorrow, who knows? But however, this isn't an absolute prohibition. And the DC inventory has listed buildings by living architects who are of an indubitable stature. I.M. Pei, for example, was living but retired when several of his buildings were designated. And we were able to convince the board that, his legacy was secure and he wasn't really going to be doing much else that could possibly lower it. So they designated several. And there are other examples for sure. Okay. By now, you're hopefully assured that your nomination has a chance of meeting at least one criterion, and you kind of have a framework for your research. I don't want to blow up this kind of, assumption by my next suggestion, but it's important to keep an open mind and be flexible as you actually begin researching. What you discover may reveal additional areas of significance, and naturally you want to be alert for those. And it may be, unfortunately, that a gang of brutal facts are going to jump out and murder your beautiful theory. But I always tell myself that detours are part of every journey, and at the end, if you seem to have some good possibilities, one of them is going to work out for you. Usually the first part of the nomination that I work on is the narrative statement of significance, which is the longer essay part of section 8. The narrative statement must tell the story of the property, but it's more than a simple biography. Every property is an individual history. I mean, something happened there. And what makes it significant is the relationship between that story and the backstory of the forces that produced the building or the property. This backstory is what the architectural historians and historic preservationists call context. The criteria you think fits your landmark candidate will shape how you research for the statement of significance and the context. If your property looks like it will meet criterion A for its connection to a specific historical event, you have to describe the event. You have to describe how your property was associated with it and how it was part of a chain of events that was important to the wider patterns of history. If the property was significant to the development of the neighborhood, you have to trace that community's growth and clearly show how the property represented the growth and how also it influenced it. If your significance appears more under criterion C, you need to tell a different story and a different backstory. If you're nominating a building that's an outstanding example of an architectural style, you need to describe the evolution of that style, cite examples, and then place your building within it. If the property is a notable work by a master architect, you need to describe the architect's career and his or her portfolio of work and explain how your building fits within that. Plainly, this section of the nomination is going to require some in-depth research, but there are strategies that are greatly going to streamline this and enable doing much of it from your home computer, which these days is a pretty big asset. DCPL regularly gives workshops on how to do house histories, and we've prepared some research handouts that give detailed guidance and have links to websites and a lot of things that will move the process forward a little faster. I'm going to briefly discuss our approach to researching a very typical nomination. And it's going to be for a Victorian townhouse that stands at 719 6th Street Northwest near the Verizon Center. Because the building is similar to others in the nearby downtown historic district, we thought when we got into it that it might have some significance under Criterion A for being associated with the development of that neighborhood. Before we start our research, I'll offer a suggestion that's based on bitter experience, though. And that is to write down your citations as you do your research. It's important to be diligent because there's nothing more frustrating than trying to remember exactly where you found an image, a fact, or a quotation. The nomination form is not as strict about format as a term paper or a thesis or, whatever, but you'll need to include thorough footnotes, as well as provide a full bibliography that's requested in section 9 of the form. If your nomination is contested or challenged, you're going to be especially glad that you documented your work on the way. Anyway, our first research step is to go to the District of Columbia's History Quest website to look at its interactive map. History Quest is a revolutionary tool that allows us to zoom in on any building in the city and its surroundings. Color coding tells us the era in which the building was constructed, but clicking on the building's footprint reveals essential detail, including the date of the construction permit and its original owner and architect. And that would be that box in the middle that hopefully I've got the cursor on. From that box, we learned that 719 6th Street was built by John Hockmeyer to the designs of an architect named S.R. Turner in 1888. And you can see this here, where the cursor is in the little arrow points. That's 719 6th Street. And if you match it up, you can see that it was built. It came out a little bit dark, but it was built between 1870 and 1889. So already we've learned something important there. As due diligence, we're going to do a Google search, just using the address and those names. And we're also going to make a visual visit to the Historic Preservation Office website. And there we're going to make a great discovery. I'm cheating a little here, but 719 6 is not in the downtown historic district, because if it were, it would already be protected and we wouldn't be nominating it. But it is right next to the district boundary. And when we get a copy of that nomination, we read that it has a lot of great detail on the neighborhood's history and patterns of development, which would also spill over for 719 6th Street. And while we're going to have to explain how the specific history of 719 relates to the themes and patterns in the district nomination, that nomination is going to just save us a heck of a lot of original research. It may also just seem lucky that we found such good documentation for this neighborhood, but the Historic Preservation Office has a lot of great information about many areas in the city. HPO has published profusely illustrated brochures about a lot of historic districts, and they've done an excellent series of heritage guides for each ward. Referring to these resources will make telling the context part of your story so much easier, so it's really worth it to call them very early in the process and just speak to them, ask what they might have, explain what you're going to try to do, and you'll find, I think, that they'll be more than helpful. So we now know much more about the house than we started, but we still need more details about its specific history and how it relates to the neighborhood's backstory. And we can learn a lot of this very fast by looking at the digitized historical images of maps at the DC Public Library and the Library of Congress websites. Perhaps the most useful, there are a lot of these maps, but perhaps the most useful are the based real estate and the Sanborn fire insurance atlases that are online at the Library of Congress. They're both works of art, and they're also encyclopedias. They were issued about every 5 years, and they present a set of snapshots that capture the patterns of growth and change in the city, one building at a time. The atlas's limitation is that although they were published from the 1880s through the 1960s, the latest editions online are circa 1920. Fortunately for us, 719 was constructed pretty early in that period, and it's going to appear on a decade's worth of maps. And this 1888 Sanborn map shows each building in the block color-coded by its construction material. Yellow is frame. The colors are a little faint in the slide, but yellow is frame, and pink is masonry. And if we look, this map was apparently printed. Hockmeyer got his permit in 1888, and this map was printed earlier, apparently, in the same year, because it shows that there was an earlier building on his lot, which, of course, the arrow is pointing at. And the clues that really tell us that here are that the front section of the building is yellow, as you see, and that means it was frame, and it had a back section that was pink. But when we saw that photograph at the beginning, his house is plainly brick. So this is just an earlier building that, was torn down to build his house. And we also see that from all the yellow rectangles that many buildings in the block and were wood. And a lot of these probably predate the Civil War, because in 1887, fire laws outlawed most frame construction. We know they can't be any later than 1877 as a result. This 1892 Hopkins Atlas Map shows Hockmeyer's house on the front of the lot. As you can see, I've got the cursor on it now. It's a brick house, like the one that's there today. And the building at the rear of the lot that has an X on it is a stable. That's the color codes of the map, and it's pretty much universal among these maps. I'm afraid my cursor disappeared, so I can't put it on there. But we see the modern building there anyway, at least part of it. The 1903 Hopkins map, which you see again, Hockmeyer's house with the yellow arrow, shows that the stable's gone, and suddenly the whole lot is a pink rectangle. And that's because his house has been expanded and fills the entire lot now. So we've shown some pretty considerable growth and change in just 15 years. Finally, this 1919 map shows Hockmeyer's house, and it's still on the front of the lot. And, it pretty much as it would appear today. And but we see that in the neighborhood, the pink footprints for larger brick buildings has replaced many of the old yellow rectangles. So the neighborhood is changing. It's being built up in brick. People are building bigger buildings. They're tearing down the old wooden ones, and they're building modern type buildings. So the virus has made the next step in our research into a little bit of a stumbling block. And although we retrieve basic permit information from HistoryQuest, as you'll recall, that's only the tip of an iceberg. Construction permits contain many details about the building's structure, and sometimes they even have renderings of its original facade, so you can see what it looked like in 1888. Unfortunately, permits for alterations document changes over the decades. But unfortunately, permit records aren't digitized. Rather, they only exist on microfilm in the local history room of the DC Public Library or at the National Archives. Hopefully, we'll have safe access to get to these records soon. For now, we kind of have to work forward without them. This is Hockmeyer's original 1888 permit. It shows a lot of detail about, his house, what it was built of, what its dimensions were, that sort of thing. And then this 1893 permit, this is Hockmeyer's house from the rear, shows a big change, that Hockmeyer's house was converted into an apartment building is what the permit shows. And, that it changed with the times. Another tool that we can't readily, and this is lastly, this is the 1929 permit that shows the building, or 1923 permit that shows the building being made into an apartment building. Another tool that we can't readily access is the building permit database. And this database can generate listings such as basic construction permit data for all the buildings in a block, or it can do all the permits for an architect's career. It's not online either, but it too is at the local history room of the DC Public Library, and it too will hopefully be accessible to us before too long. This listing of Samuel R. Turner's permit shows that he designed a row of buildings that included John Hockmeyer's grocery store in 1883. So you can see that there are some very valuable uses for this building permits database. Learning about Samuel R. Turner's architecture career is more difficult without the permit index, but there is a workaround for not having access to it for now. The Historic Preservation Office has created a biographical database of over 100 leading architects and builders. And these are two-page summaries that present a biography of the architect and list his or her most significant works. As it happens, the database is such a summary for Samuel R. Turner. The database isn't online, but the way we got this is from just requesting it from the Historic Preservation Office. That's another reason to call them. They can let you know right off the bat if they have a a biography on the architect or builder or owner, and they're very generous with sharing them. It would be useful to trace the ownership of the land that 719 stands on, back to the beginning. Images of land ownership records like deeds, mortgages, liens, covenants, and releases are online at the Recorder of Deeds website. And these images only cover documents after 1921, but you can get paper copies of earlier records at the DC archives. One very, very important thing about deeds and permits are that racial segregation was part and parcel of the story of housing in Washington. And it was enforced by restrictive covenants that covered properties all over the city. Such covenants can be, if they exist, they are an important chapter in the history of your building and the development of the neighborhood. And you really want to find them and note them in your history if they're there. I don't have a copy or don't have an image of one of these covenants because I don't believe there was one for 719-6, but because it costs a couple of dollars to print them out. At this point, the maps and permits have hopefully revealed a lot about the physical development of the neighborhood in our building, but history is also a story of social development. We now need to put people in these houses, and to do this, we'll look at census records and city directory records. Census records are the most useful sources of information about people. Publicly accessible records cover each census from 1790 through 1940, though about 99% of the individual records from 1890 were destroyed in a fire. And the data for 1950 will become accessible in 2022, which is something else to look forward to. Though through 1950, the census was taken by enumerators who walked down each block, and they visited each household and successfully recorded the data for each person in the household on a very ledger-like register, which is what you see here. The enumerator would visit the houses on the odd and even sides of the street in succession, and they were not generally supposed to cross back and forth. So as a result, all the addresses on the odd or even side of a block tend to be listed together in the register. So when you locate your building's entries, you'll learn all about the neighbors as well as its own residents. The census collected information about each person in the household, including their age, sex, and race, as well as their educational status, employment, birthplace, and immigration information. Taken together, these records provide a portrait of the building's residents as well as a richly depicted social backdrop. And looking at each successive census, you can trace how the building fits into the evolving patterns of the neighborhood. Census records are digitally searchable and you can access them online very easily. Two very convenient sites are the National Archives and the DC Public Library websites. As the 1923 permit suggested, these records from the 1930 census confirm that 719-6 had been made into an apartment building with 5 units. As we see in 1930, 1 unit was shared by 5 families rather, which may reflect the hard times at the beginning of the Depression. And another interesting detail about the building is that one of its renters was an African American as well as having white renters. This is very rare in segregated Washington. You don't see that very often in this era. City directories are useful because they chart residents from year to year, while the census is updated only every 10 years. Washington directories were published almost every year from before the Civil War through the 1960s, and they listed so-called heads of household alphabetically until 1914, when they adopted a crisscross feature that listed every street's addresses in numerical order with their residents' names. By cross-referencing each name with a crisscross section with its alphabetic listing, it's possible to develop a more detailed portrait of the building's residents and neighbors. The full run of Washington City Directories has been digitized, and it's available online from subscription services like Ancestry.com. Some volumes are accessible through Google Books and other sources. The Library of Congress and the local history room of the DC Public Library have each year's directory on microfilm through the beginning of World War II. Directories appear only intermittently during the war, and coverage is pretty spotty afterwards. This is one of the non-crisscross directories. It's from 1893, and it shows the location of John Hockmeyer's business. which is information the census wouldn't have collected. Directories circa 1890 are doubly important because of the destruction of the 1890 census registers in a fire. Here's a more modern directory that has the crisscross directory section on the left, or on the viewer's left, and the alphabetic section on the right. And here you can see that cross-referencing the crisscross and alphabetic sections of the directory help pin down the occupations of 719.6 tenants. And interesting, only one of the households that is listed in the building in 1930 when the census taker came was listed in 1929, which suggests that the neighborhood had become really very transient by that time, which shows something about its development. The Daily Record. It's hard to believe, but for many decades, Washington had 6 daily citywide newspapers. In addition, other newspapers were serving the African-American community in individual neighborhoods. Today, virtually a great many of these papers are available online and are digitally searchable. The Library of Congress's Chronicling America website is a huge digital archive that has dozens of Washington papers, including many short-lived ones that are very hard to find. With a single query, you can search all the papers at once and sort your results by either date or relevance. However, Chronicling America only covers most papers through 1922, which I believe is for copyright reasons. The citywide papers with the longest publication time span are the Washington Evening Star, which was published from 1854 until 1981, and the Washington Post, which started publication in 1877. You can access the full runs of the Post and Star at the DC Public Library website, and all you need is a DC Public Library card to log in. My strategy for mining newspapers is kind of a scattershot approach. I just run queries on for the address of the building, the name of the owner, the name of the architect, really any other names that look, you've come across. And then I assemble the articles into a timeline. And running such searches for this building generated almost 250 articles. This was with queries like 719 6th Street, John Hockmeyer, S.R. Turner, just some of the other names that have been associated with it over a period of 132 years it's been around. So now we have a pile of factual tiles, and it's time to make a mosaic portrait of the house and its landscape. From History Quest and permit information, we know that 719.6 was built in 1888 for John Hockmeyer, and then its designer was S.R. Turner. From the architect database, we learned a lot about Turner, and we learned he was very active. He was a busy architect, but he didn't design any particularly notable buildings. There's not a lot of special features about any of his work. And so for this and related reasons, 719 is probably not going to be a really good fit under Criterion C. But the information we've gathered does fit pretty well with Criterion A. The historic district nomination told us that the neighborhood around the house was near the core of the city's downtown retail district in the 19th century. Immigrants from Germany played a very substantial role as business proprietors, and a lot of them built houses near their stores. The directories and the census records and newspapers tell us that John Hockmeyer was a German immigrant, and he enlisted in the Union Army, and he fought in 25 Civil War battles. And after the war ended, he settled in Washington. And in 1867, he placed an advertisement that showed that he had started a restaurant downtown, just a couple blocks from where he built his house. But John Hockmeyer was a very entrepreneurial person. And the directories also show that he subsequently opened a meat market, a grocery store, and then he had a tea stall in the Center Market, which was the big marketplace in the city and was located where the National Archives building is today. His biography and his house's stories thus seem to dovetail very well with the story of the neighborhood that was growing up with it. So that's a plus. Now, we also learned from the newspapers that Hockmeyer was a very convivial person, and he became an officer in several German fraternal orders. And newspaper articles also show that he founded several social clubs, which they talk about here. One of them was the Jolly Fat Man, and another one was the Buena Vista Social Club. And these clubs hired him to be their steward, and they became a business for him. And as the Atlas Map and the 1893 permit show, he built a clubhouse addition to the rear of his house, which became known as Hockmeyer Hall. That's where the stable went, and that's why the map filled in as a big pink rectangle that covers the whole lot. Unfortunately, this life of conviviality and accomplishment had a really sad ending. The newspapers show that Hockmeyer developed disabling arthritis, which he blamed on sleeping outside all during the Civil War. And at the same time, the doings at the the Jolly Fat Man Club could appear very noisy, and they were pretty disruptive and rowdy. In 1898, his neighbors managed to have his liquor license canceled. So in pain and under a lot of financial pressure, sadly, Hockmeyer shot himself in August 1899. And it actually was front page news in at least 2 of these 3 papers. Directories and census records show then that his widow sold the house to one of Washington's premier ballroom dance instructors, who expanded the clubhouse into a ballroom. Directories and permits show that as the neighborhood became less fashionable, the house was split up into apartments in the 1920s. And newspapers show that the ballroom became sort of a rent-a-space. It was a public hall that was frequently rented out for union meetings, as you see there, for the big streetcar strike of 1920. The apartments also seem to have attracted like a pretty, some pretty rough tenants. I'm not saying everybody was, but they included a police officer who moonlighted as a fake prohibition officer and went out and committed very violent robberies of suspected bootleggers that were really pretty brutal. And he got locked up for that. 7196 story and its backstory thus relate Hockmeyer Hall pretty strongly to Criterion A through its association with the development and evolution and patterns of change in the downtown historic district neighborhood, and also to its German-American business community who founded it. So we're probably looking pretty good to go with Criterion A here. So after you've completed your draft of the Statement of Significance, it's probably most efficient to turn your attention to the architectural section. There's a reason to do them in this order, which I'll come to. And while many people think that this section is going to be really complex and full of technical jargon, it really doesn't need to be. In the narrative description, you're going to paint a detailed verbal picture of the building and its setting. It's more important that this be clear and complete than that it employ fancy architectural terms. The key to doing this is to be a very patient observer and a very thorough recorder of the details of the building. And one of the best ways to simplify the architectural section is to become really familiar with the building. There's really no substitute for viewing it in person, often at, best different times of day, different conditions of light. And when you're looking, remember that you'll need to describe each facade of the building, not just the side that faces the street. You should take plenty of pictures to refresh your memory because impressions get blurry really fast. Conclusives of details will always be helpful as well. And toward our conclusion, we're going to talk about the specs for the photographs that must accompany the nomination. And hopefully you can use some of the images you take now to fulfill this requirement. Your description should start with a summary paragraph that gives the basic facts about the building, such as its setting, its type or function, its size, the number of stories, and the materials. For example, you might say 7196 is a 3-story brick building with a flat roof and a full-height semi-cylindrical bay on the south side of its front facade. You're then going to write additional paragraphs that describe the building in more detail, starting from a fixed point like its roof line. Work your way across each story, describing each significant element. For example, here you'll describe each window or set of windows, their sash patterns, the sills below them and the lintels above them, and the ornamental courses of brick that span the facade in each story. When you finish describing the lowest level of the front facade, you'll repeat that process starting with the roof line of each side and then the rear. As the National Register Guide notes, your description should address the evolution of the building as well as what you see today. You're going to want to identify any modifications you can spot. Looking at the building through the prism of its permits and maps, which you reviewed in doing the Statement of Significance, are going to give you some insight into the ways that it's changed over the years. That's why it's probably better to do the Statement of Significance first. But the degree to which the building has been altered raises an iceberg, which is the issue of integrity. A building may be deemed ineligible for designation if it has lost its historic identity, as the National Register calls it. One rule of thumb is that changes are less damaging if they're reversible. For example, vinyl replacement windows can in turn be replaced with replicas of original wooden sashes. But it's, however, a lot more serious if the character-defining features of the building have been permanently altered. For example, if the apertures were enlarged by knocking out bricks to fit bigger windows. Determining a building's integrity is kind of a judgment call, but if you observe well, hopefully after noting any alterations, you'll be able to write that this sentence, which is that despite these modifications, the building retains its historic integrity. Now that you've gotten through the long essay questions, you've only got some identifications and fill in the blank questions to go. It's like an exam. You're getting on to the home stretch. Of course, information in these sections is very important, but the National Register has helped you out a lot because they've published guides that are very, very detailed. The guides contain tables of entries for each item. And while it's possible to really agonize and split hairs over which entry absolutely fits each particular item, most of them are going to be pretty straightforward. There are a few that take more thought. The National Register form also requires some geographic data and some map attachments. You can look up the latitude and longitude information for Section 10 with the Google search. And that's really not generally too much of a problem. The nomination also requires a USGS map that shows the property's location. You can get these for free. You can download them. It looks like you have to pay for them, but you really don't. If you click the download button from the USGS website, and then if you have any kind of basic photo editing program like Photoshop or, really anything like that, you can even do it in PowerPoint. You can cut a section from the USGS map that shows the area where the property is, and then use Photoshop or similar software to place a dot at the building's location, which you can see right there. You can also, if you don't have Photoshop, you can just print out the USGS map section and draw the dot on it and scan it, or take a photo with your phone. It works. It just has to be clear. And then this is not a National Register requirement, but the DC Historic Preservation Office likes to see a map that displays the property in its lot and square. And we can download this from the DC government's Property Quest website and paste it and the USGS website onto continuation sheets that go at the end of the nomination. And this, the yellow rectangle here is 719 6th there. Cursor's not being cooperative. And you can see it on the, the various property lines, and the lot numbers are there. So that really helps them to, to really situate it, and a good thing to paste in. And then the very last section of the nomination describes the documentary digital photographs required by the National Register. And the Historic Preservation Office is going to use these photos for reference too when they look at the nomination. So it's important that they be pretty clear, pretty comprehensive. The most important specification is that the photographs for the National Register should be a minimum of 3,000 by 2,000 pixels at 300 pixels per square inch. At a minimum, you'll need an image of each of the building's facades, as we mentioned, but close-ups of details are also a big part of these National Register documentary images. And you don't need to print these images, and you don't need to insert them in the nomination itself, but you do need to have a list that meets the specs that they have below. And this is generally pasted into the nomination after the maps on a continuation sheet. Many nominations can be enriched with historic photographs or images of the historic maps, and these you would also paste onto continuation sheets and append them to the end of the nomination after the maps. Those do not have to meet the 3,000 by 2,000, pixels requirement. You just obviously want them to be clear. One little thing I'll caution about, though, is if you have spent a lot of time massaging and clarifying and enhancing your historic images, and you paste them in, be very careful when you save your file with either Microsoft Word or Adobe Acrobat, because the default setting can compress the images and really kind of ruin them. If the image clarity of the images is really good and you want to preserve that, you have to set the specifications for your software to accommodate that. I just throw that out there because I've done that and really regretted it afterwards. So now we're on the other side of the mountain, and you've assembled your completed National Register form. You've got the signed DC cover sheet and the photographic images, and you feel like you've scaled a peak. But now we have to talk briefly about what happens on the other side. If you're not the building's owner, or you're not working with the owner to secure designation, you should approach him or her before filing the nomination. This is not a requirement. There's no legal requirement that you do that, but nonetheless, it's a very good idea to do it. Even when the building is under threat, it's not unheard of for an opponent to become a supporter when you explain the meaning of designation and why you want to do it. And you always stress the benefits of designation, and you don't accuse the person of trying to ruin the city, and you respond candidly to questions. In addition to phone contact, what we do at DCPL is that we notify the property owner in writing that we do intend to file the nomination. We send them that notice via certified mail, and we include a copy of the landmark invitation and an invitation to talk. We also notify the ANC, the Advisory Neighborhood Commission, the council member, and the State Historic Preservation Officer of our intention to file, and we give them 30 days notice. And the idea is to establish dialogue with them. You can't lose by it. If the person becomes completely hostile, you can file right away, I suppose, if you felt you really needed to, although we don't. But this process can be done by email, and you can include a copy of the landmark nomination. And then your nomination package, along with a check for the filing fee, which is $100 for an individual building, has to be filed with the Historic Preservation Office. And the office has 3 business days to review your submission and let you know if it doesn't meet the specifications for a nomination of the DC inventory. If it does, they feel it doesn't meet, they tell you why, and then you can address that problem. Otherwise, the nomination is considered filed, and the notice to that effect is printed in the DC Register. I should point out, filing an individual nomination has the effect of temporarily putting the property under the protection of the DC Historic Preservation Law. In other words, from its filing to the hearing before the HPRB, no permits can be issued to raise the property or otherwise diminish its historic significance, such as altering the facade, for example. Conversely, if a permit was issued before the filing was made, it remains in force. The filing doesn't stop it. So that's one argument for being proactive. The Historic Preservation Office then sends a notice to the property's owner of record that a nomination is filed, and they advise the Advisory Neighborhood Commission, whose jurisdiction includes the property, that it is 30 days to provide comments to the Historic Preservation Review Board. And this may be your busiest part of the whole process. Essentially, you need to conduct outreach on behalf of the nomination. You have to get out and talk to people. It's likely the ANC will want to discuss the nomination at its next meeting, and their opinion is going to be entitled to great weight when the HPRB has its hearing. So you don't want to wait for them to contact you. You want to make yourself available for questions and be prepared to make a case to them for why the building should be designated. You may also want to use this time to line up letters of support to the review board. The most influential letters of support really come from neighbors and other members of the community whose, the building to be landmarked is a part of their daily lives, and the board pays a lot of attention to what they have to say. Letters of support from them are really incredibly valuable. And at the end of the 30-day public notice period, the HPRB is going to schedule a hearing on the nomination. If the owner is seeking to get a permit, like to raise or alter the building, the hearing date is going to come up quite quickly. And otherwise, it can take several months because the HPRB's calendar is really jammed. In fact, it may be more than several months. Since the HPRB has begun meeting virtually since the beginning of the pandemic, the format of the hearings has been changed. But I'm going to describe the established procedures in the belief that we'll be returning to them one day. The hearings take place on the 4th Thursday of every month except August. Prior to the hearing, the HPRB, or HPO rather, will assign a staff architectural historian to review your nomination thoroughly. The historian will write an in-depth review of the nomination that recommends whether the review board should designate the property. The report will be sent to the HPRB members along with the nomination and released to the public 1 week before the hearing. So at that point, you'll kind of know what the the HPO staff is recommending. And it's a very in-depth report. At the hearing, the sponsor of the nomination, which is you or your sponsor, makes a presentation to the full review board, followed by the HPO staff member who wrote the staff report. And the staff member delivers the HPO recommendation, and then the owner of the building or his or her representative responds to the previous testimony. And after that, the floor is open for testimony from members of the public. The HPRB members can ask questions of those testifying at any time. After testimony is complete, the HPRB members deliberate publicly and vote on the nomination. A negative majority means that the nomination can't be resubmitted for a year. A majority vote in the affirmative means the building becomes a landmark when the HPRB's decision is certified by the mayor's agent for historic preservation. And then comes the last and best part of the nomination. That's a celebration if you got designated. It's really quite a high to see your long labor rewarded with a listing. And it's not like being an architect or a builder, but in a way, you've really put a permanent fingerprint on the city. If you'd like to learn more about landmark nominations, there's no better way than working on one. The DCPL Landmarks Committee is always working on a few projects, and we welcome volunteers. So if you're curious, we've got an inexhaustible supply of worthy buildings. Follow the contact information I'm sure Melissa's going to share, and maybe we'll see you at our next virtual meeting. Thanks an awful lot. I'm glad to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Peter. That was really informative, really helpful, and thank you so much for presenting. So yeah, I mean, if anybody has any questions, please feel free, like I said, to put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We did get one question so far from Facebook. Brian from Facebook, he wanted to know about the role of photography in a landmark designation, which I think you covered very well, Peter, but he wanted to know, can an application be won or lost with especially good photography? Like what, you know?
That's an excellent question, Brian. Photography is very, very, very important. It's, you know, the artistry of it is even important there for a couple of reasons. One is, of course, if the building gets on the National Register, your photographs are going to represent it forever. So, you know, it's immortality for, you know, the look of the building that's kind of in your hands really there. The other thing is that, particularly with Criterion C, if you're arguing for its aesthetic significance, yes, I mean, you want to try to put that across the best way you can and, you know, use every trick in the book that you know. All's fair, I think. I mean, you obviously can't alter the, you know, you can't, you know, alter it in Photoshop or something, but, you know, yeah, the look of it counts. And then even if it's not Criterion C, and, you know, the board is going to look at it, and even if it's not objectively part of the process, you know, the look of the building has a subjective effect on everybody who sees it. That said, you know, some buildings can look pretty bad, or they can have pretty murky photographs and they win, but no, it's definitely a plus.
Yeah, and kind of to follow up on that, he mentioned like what makes an especially good architectural photograph. I think especially close-ups, right, are very good. Like, do you have any kind of tips for that?
They're good. I mean, one thing you have to do is you have to kind of pick your time. Timing is important in everything, particularly photography. You know, your building, depending which side of the street is on, may look better in the afternoon or in the morning. You want to kind of avoid deep shadows, you know, on the building. You don't want to get it backlit. You know, if you get the sun behind it, that's pretty fatal. I think usually the most architectural photographs. You want to get a good angle from every side if you can. You learn to love alleys because that gets you behind the building, and otherwise it can be tough. If it's a row house, obviously you may not be able to get the sides, but it's kind of this. I'd say strategy does make a difference there.
And for anybody who's interested in learning more about taking photographs of historic buildings, earlier this month we actually had a webinar with the Heritage Documentation Programs of the National Park Service. And that presentation can be found on our YouTube channel as well, a recording of that. We had some photographers kind of walk us through some good practices and stuff for that as well. So all the links are in the chat for that.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I mean, the HABS photographers are kind of like, you know, as close to Ansel Adams as we're likely to see.
Right.
I mean, they're really good.
Yeah, they were great. So Deborah asked, do you know, this is not, I guess this is not DC focused, but maybe you might know the answer, Peter. Do you know if Montgomery County, Maryland has any of these same research resources? I've been striking out with permits, info about architects, historical newspapers, etc.
You know, I'm pretty sure they do. I'm probably a poor guide to how to find them because I've never actually done research in Montgomery County. There is a person who works for the Montgomery County Planning Office named Claire Kelly, who's an architectural historian who's done spectacular work on modernism and modernist buildings in Montgomery County, who I've worked with on a couple of projects, who's an excellent resource. I think she could probably point you more in the right direction, but I'm sure those things do exist.
Haven't really gotten other questions. Somebody did ask, can we get copies of the presentation slides? Yeah, I mean, we can put those up on the website, I think. I think you can get some good links too, Peter, if you don't mind.
Sure, yeah, we can do that.
Mm-hmm. And Lauren said, thank you, very helpful. So thank you, Lauren, for the kind words.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's very nice.
Mm-hmm.
And I did want to just reiterate, you know, our landmarks committee meets every month, and you know, Jess is our coordinator, and you know, we're always anxious if you have the urge to do a landmark nomination or even curious about it, you know, you can just come in and sort of see what we do, and you know, if it's interesting to you, you know, maybe you want to become a member. We do have a lot of work always, and you know, we generally nobody would get you know, a whole nomination inflicted on them, but you know, you do part of one to get started.
Yeah, DCPL, we are so thankful for all the hard work that our volunteers do, especially the landmarks committee, because like Peter said, just the amount of time it takes to put together something like this, and then you might even have to go back and do revisions and everything. It's a lot of work. So we're very thankful, and you know, we would not be able to accomplish the things that we do with all of your wonderful help and support, Peter. And yeah, we do encourage, if you would like to be a volunteer on any of our committees, we have a few others, that you become a member, just because of the amount of kind of like what you oversee and what you work on for the organization and some of the decision making. But you know, we do allow you to come to like 1 or 2 meetings before you really make that decision, without having to become a member, just to see if it's the right fit for you. So yeah, definitely, if you're interested, please feel free to email us at info@dcpreservation.org. We're always happy to have new volunteers. Yep, just put the link into the chat as well, directly to the form that you would fill out to become a volunteer. And Laura just wrote in preservationmaryland.org seems great for previous questions. So thank you so much, Laura. Very helpful. And Betsy said, excellent presentation, Peter. Thank you.
Oh, very nice. Thank you.
I'm getting another question. Okay, yeah, so quick follow-up question from Facebook. Jessica just sent us over from Brian again. So quick follow-up, is video ever used? If so, how and what was the impact as distinct from still photography?
Well, that's a very good question. This is showing my obsolete tech here. Video is very important. You don't put it in the nomination, but at the hearing, you can show a video to the HPRB, and they do like them. We've generally you would do a PowerPoint or some presentation of that nature for the HPRB because they like images quite a bit, and they need to see them. And people have begun, and we've begun sometimes embedding little videos in there. We've done some bits of historic newsreels. We've done other videos even we took of some of the buildings. We kind of walk around it in a circle. We've never tried to videotape a whole presentation, although we probably could. But embedding them at the hearing is really the thing. I don't know that there's any way you can attach them to the nomination. But yeah, they're I think we'll see a lot more of that in the next few years.
Definitely, and it'll be interesting to see that used more. That'd be pretty neat.
Yeah.
So we have run out of time, fortunately, but I would just like to say thank you all so much for attending today's program, for taking time out of your day to learn about this subject. I hope it was super helpful for you, and a special thank you to our wonderful presenter, Peter, for sharing your expertise with us and for all the hard work that you've been doing for DCPL, and it's been wonderful. So again, if you have any additional questions that were not addressed, please feel to email them to us. Our email address is in the chat. Again, a recording of this presentation will be made available on our YouTube channel soon, and that link is also in the chat. So you can stay up to date on all of our work and upcoming events on our website, www.dcpreservation.org, and by even subscribing to our monthly e-newsletter. We usually send out a email about upcoming events, and then something that kind of just talks about like the work that DCPL is doing as a whole, and a lot of our like advocacy efforts. So we encourage you to sign up for that. And again, if you're interested in volunteering for the Landmarks Committee or any of the other committees, Jess had put that link into the chat about where you can sign up for that. And again, we're so thankful for our volunteers, and we hope that you guys are interested in also becoming a volunteer. So yeah, thank you so much again, and we hope that you all enjoy the rest of your day, even though it's raining, but hopefully, you know, the weather will get better. And thank you again, Peter, and we hope to see you at more DCPL events soon.
Yes, well, thank you, Jess and Melissa. That, you know, was a good experience, and thank you all for tuning in.